Longtime students will probably tell you that when it comes to history, I'm a sucker for three things: immersion, authenticity, and a really, really good story. And, I gotta say, I was bullied into this one. Um, I normally don't really play strategy games. I didn't grow up playing Risk all that much in terms of a board game. And, when a student suggested this one a while back, I gotta say, I definitely took some convincing. And, also, I'll say this was a mixed bag in terms of a game experience overall. I just gotta say, I'm really glad that I gave Total War: The Three Kingdoms a chance. I mean, a lot of people don't. A lot of people think that the historical novel doesn't work as a game. It doesn't work as a playable experience. That the story will drift too far or it'll be historically inaccurate. Let's take a look at George R. R. Martin. The guy really doesn't think so.
Dragons or read a comic book. Today it seems that when kids want to, younger readers want to experience world building, they go to video games. Do you see video games as a threat to fantasy writers like yourself who are presenting whole worlds in like books like The World of Ice and Fire for people to investigate? Are video games something that you think are eating away at writing or challenging what you do?
Ultimately, video games are going to become a new art form. I don't think they're there yet. They're fun. They're not art, but they could be art.
Yeah, but George, when you write your novels, you borrow a lot from history. And you'd probably be, maybe a little bit surprised to know that most games do as well. The same is true for movies. Again, back during the late 90s and early 2000s, history sold. People bought these books wanting to learn more. People went to the movies wanting to experience a time period. I mean, come on, some of these big blockbusters were, some of the more favorited movies back in the day. And while their accuracy is something that is absolutely up for question, most of them being not very accurate, especially some of the earlier ones. And we could spend all day talking about the accuracy in some of these big Hollywood movies. There's a lot of YouTube channels out there that focus on that very thing. Totally a conversation to be had. But as people went to the theater expecting what it was like in the Roman Colosseum and left feeling like what they just watched was definitely not what it was like in the Roman Colosseum, movies started to turn more towards the dramatic stories of the past, like 300 or 2004's Troy, which was about Homer's The Iliad. A movie that tried to balance the fantasy elements with a realistic ancient war movie. And the reception was pretty mixed to pretty poor. It didn't really pick one side. It didn't go full the gods are affecting the battles, and didn't go full it's all, realistic and immersion. And it left a sour taste, except for this awesome battle scene. Unforgettable. I mean, come on. The Hector versus Achilles fight was what got me into history as a kid. I mean, maybe it was historically ridiculous in terms of the costumes or the fact that that's not really how the fight played out in the story, but it worked on the screen. And it captured the, major theme of the Iliad, or at least one of the major themes, which was this was a character drama, a epic about character. And which to me overshadowed a lot of the diversions that the movie makes from the actual story, or the nitpicking authenticity problems. And if you click on this link, it's hilarious just how little they actually talk about. Oh wait, look at this. They made a Total War game about Troy too. I'm not shocked, but oh god, I'm probably not gonna end up playing this one. Don't make me do this one as well. They made a Troy Total War as well. And of course, just like the cinematic soap operas, the Rome Total War games have been no stranger to criticism as well. Remember the Fire Pigs only representing two Islamic factions during the medieval era? Or how about these costumes that look like they're out of a 1950s world history textbook? But, you know, that was then, and this is now. We're here to see if they learned from some of these mistakes. We're here to see if the next installment in this series can right some of these wrongs. We'll see if they go the path of the novel and tell a story that's 7 parts fact and 3 parts fiction. Or will the developers stick to the historical records from the Three Kingdoms time period? So as always, we're here to judge the story, the gameplay, and the major themes of the Three Kingdoms era in Chinese history. So, Creative Assembly, it's time. Say it with me, people. Let's see if you did your homework. Before we get into talking about the story and the presentation, I just wanted to say that when I bought this game on Steam, I actually had purchased all of the DLC and patches and features, not really knowing they were there. And I started off with the Yellow Turban DLC, which I guess is like a prequel to the actual game. But anyways, history-wise, this really was a great place to start for me, at least, because I thought most of the game was kind of setting the stage of the Three Kingdoms anyways. So since the game wastes absolutely no time getting you into the characters and factions and conflicts, I thought it'd be a good idea to switch things up a little bit and take a look at some of the background before these events take place, because, you know, this could be a really, really confusing story without some of the background knowledge.
Did you see those Huns? They popped out of the snow like daisies!
Let's wind the clocks back to the fall of the Han Dynasty, which was really the precursor of all of these events to take place throughout the game. The Han Dynasty was a golden age for ancient China. In a number of ways. They had a flourishing trade network with their connection to the Silk Road. They had made many advances in technology. They had a strong centralized government. But over time, tensions had really been growing, especially in the northern provinces, who were rightfully upset by the level of corruption from things all the way going up as high as the emperor's official courts, the eunuchs at the time. These leaders were incredibly ineffective and oftentimes enforced some really wild taxes and legal blunders. Mix all that with a series of natural disasters and a really bad famine season, and you have the makings of a serious rebellion. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, as it was called, was really the undoing for the Han Dynasty. Many of the leaders of this rebellion claim that the Han had lost their mandate of heaven, and thus a great divide will soon begin. So ultimately what we're talking about here is a time period of civil war in Chinese history. And from here, the game really lets you decide what the fate of China is going to become. So overall, I'm going to be critical here and say that the game could have done a much better job of setting the stage here. Because, you know, from here on out, it's really assumed that you know these characters very well, depending on how you start the game. Of course, I picked the DLC. I think that was a better choice. But yeah, the game definitely throws you right into the fire and, you know, kind of says good luck figuring out these major historical names and characters and motivations and you know where the story is going. But if you thought the story was off to a confusing start, just wait until you see what this game has in store for how to play it. I was unbelievably overwhelmed when I first booted this thing up. I had no idea how to interact with this, how to click, how to move. There's just so much to do and so much to figure out. Don't get me wrong, I did end up liking all of the options, all of the things that this game lets you do over time, but if you haven't played something like this before, plan on a long learning curve. I do think there's a lot to appreciate here in terms of like the elements, the resource management, all of the different kind of organizational stuff you can do to prepare for a battle and, you know, make sure that your army is in the best position to do well, or, you know, understanding the personality of your generals. So we'll come back to this. My hat's off to the developers. They packed so much content in here to really give you the full experience of what it would be like to manage a kingdom to start from the ground up and really grow a dynasty, and so much more so than just the military level of things. I was really taken aback by how much time I spent doing other things than just focusing on my army. The team wanted to add a lot of variety outside of the battles, so obviously they emphasize trade, managing population growth. There's like an alliance system that's similar to Shadow of Mordor. I'm not kidding. You can like spy on different warlords during your rise. You can convince soldiers from an army that you just defeat to join your own, and they each have their own kind of motivations here. So really they packed a ton of content into such a small time period. Most of the time it works. It gives you that feeling of being an overwhelmed leader with tons of different decisions to make and lots of different options that you have to focus on before you make key big moves on the board. But when we get into gameplay, we'll see how not all of these choices really made that big of a difference in the overall historical experience. Some of them are better left ignored, or can just be incredibly time consuming. So it's interesting that they left all of these features in there. I just would have really liked many more of them to be much more important. But we'll highlight some of these gaming features later because they have their historical roots. Now, graphically, the art style really nails it here. They try to capture a Ming Dynasty time period mixed with some classical Chinese art, and what it brings to life the most is these kind of sharp edges on a lot of the different on-screen animations, and really beautiful stuff. They absolutely killed it in this department. It looks like you're kind of turning a page many times, and the architecture is spot on for the time period. Color and animation wise, there's really two distinct feels. Starting with the battlefield perspective, it's very rugged, it's very grimy, very dark, just kind of meant to reflect the brutality of the fighting style from this time period. But combine that with the landscape, and you have these beautiful mountain ranges, this almost like ambience-driven aesthetic to the setting and natural world around it. I felt like this was a little bit jarring. At times, it was almost like people were fighting for this beauty in this land. But going from such a pleasant, nice, quiet vista to a screaming, shouting battlefield was quite the turn, was quite the twist. That being said, I have to give a lot of points for creating such a believable Chinese setting. It really mixed a lot of animation styles from the Ming Dynasty period here, and I think it absolutely looks totally gorgeous just to move the mouse around and look at all the different things that are happening on the map. Then there's the occasional cutscene, which actually triggers as part of the story if you do the right things leading up to a historically accurate event from the Three Kingdoms time period, which I thought was a really nice touch. But most of my time was spent on this map and really just kind of customizing my experience and learning the systems. So I think this is probably a pretty good time to get into some of the various options, because here's where the game, in my opinion, really shines with its historical accuracy. And the theme that Creative Assembly was definitely going with is choice. And when I'm talking about choice, I mean that in terms of the game modes and in terms of how the game itself plays, depending on whichever mode you end up choosing. So to give you an example, again, after being brave enough, I went through many of the different game options, and I found a number of different features that you can turn on and off. So again, the choice is yours for a more immersive, bloody experience, or a more board game-like experience. I'm not kidding. You can literally turn blood on and off. I found as though they tried to kind of cater to both audiences there. And unlike Troy that tried to cater to both audiences, I think this really works because it does give you the ability to choose whether or not you like this feature on and off. And of course, it wasn't just turning blood on or off to add to the immersion. It was more or less turning on some of the different difficulty sliders that I found actually made the game more accurate. For example, different factions will act more aggressively if you choose to go with this setting, and it definitely makes the game more difficult at times, but also I think forces players to read up on what their decisions are rather than just kind of blindly going about the board and sort of just kind of hoping that, oh well, every alliance is either going to work or it isn't, because you're often rewarded based on how well you understand your situation or what leader you're up against, or even your own warlord's personality as well. I found those to be very interesting features in the game. The most rewarding feature I found ended up actually being one of the more historically accurate aspects of the game, and that's the emphasis on trade. You have to establish different alliances across the board. You have to make an effort to understand what resources other groups need and want, and I thought this absolutely was a step in the right direction. Again, it took the conversation away from the battlefield and more towards really the growth of a kingdom's prosperity overall. That's not to say that all of the added content here really adds to the overall experience. I found population to be kind of unnecessary. It just sort of does its own thing. You don't really have to micromanage it. And probably the most annoying of all the features is just how often major generals and warlords die out of turn. Mostly just due to like old age, or they fight in meaningless battles and don't survive. And this de-emphasizes all of the reading that you do to prepare and plan a couple of moves ahead. If the major characters that you're reading about are dying every 20 minutes, then it sort of defeats the purpose of knowing them and understanding them and getting ready for, an hour later I'm gonna have to face this person. So ultimately it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back for me in terms of how historically authentic the gameplay felt. From gameplay, we'll shift gears to talking a little bit about the story and the 2 modes that the story's narrative can really take. The first one being the more classic Total War experience called the Records mode. This is based off of, you guessed it, historical records. And here, I think they've really gone for much more of a strategy kind of experience. The battles are longer. There's a lot more emphasis on the preparation and a lot more emphasis on, obviously, the realism of what it would have been like during these time periods. Characters are still important in this mode, but they definitely take a back seat and don't really make a big difference in the battles as they play out. It's more about positioning. Then there's the Romance mode, which is based off of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a novel written about 1,000 years after these events took place. Here it's much more about characters. The various heroes and villains that you play as or play against play a major role, and understanding their personalities is more the key to victory than strategy is. For example, you could pretty much take certain characters and just have them standing alone on the battlefield, and pending your timing, you can win. So, one person fighting against 100, wouldn't that be wildly historically inaccurate? Isn't that a point off? Well, interestingly, no. I think this actually follows pretty faithfully the story of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and I was pleasantly surprised by just how well fleshed out this mode was as well. It adds a lot more fantasy elements, and ultimately I think this is a great little addition that they went with here to let players choose which kind of the history they'd like to play out. Of course, it wouldn't be a total war game if we didn't talk about the real-time battles. So everybody wants to know, is this what it really was like? You know, is this what it looked like in the heat of things? Is this what it was like to really prepare when you were on the battlefield? Are the weapons accurate? Is it, you know, is this how a traditional battle during the Three Kingdoms era would play out? And that answer is super complicated. So to make a concession first, I will say that gameplay-wise, they have a lot of different things that they're up against. They're trying to create a balanced system, okay? You know, they want to make sure that the game mechanics are something that play probably the biggest role. And then, of course, there's the progression system that they're up against as well. The game has to get more difficult over time, which obviously, given the different size of the armies and stuff, isn't really all that realistic or authentic to the Three Kingdoms time period. That being said, where the game shines in terms of the kind of battle that it depicts, it really, really shines. Cavalry is absolutely as effective as it would have been. Certain elements on the battlefield, like where you position your archers or artillery, really make a big difference in terms of the tide of winning and losing a skirmish. And absolutely, you know, this is definitely what led to a win or a loss, or a victory or a defeat. So here, I would say, you know, it's accurate to a point. It's as accurate as I think it can be, which I think is more than enough. Now this is where I think our conversation starts to drift to an end. Let's talk about the overall experience. Is it historically accurate enough that it can be used in a conversation? Can you learn from it? Could it be used in a classroom? All of those answers are kind of a surprising no, and there's an important reason behind it. While I loved all of the content and all of the features and the idea of the customizable experience of the game, oftentimes I felt as though I didn't win battles because of my knowledge of a specific battle, but because I doubled down on a couple of the different game systems, and this wasn't always very accurate. I mean, you know, overall towards the story, my faction looked very different from beginning to end, and it definitely drifted from the kind of personality of the Three Kingdoms time period. The irony being, of course, that I actually ended up finishing and getting to the end game with the exact three kingdoms that are in the story. But, you know, that's kind of by design from the game. You know, they are at the start the three largest of the factions. They're the most powerful, they're the strongest, and they're the most likely to, you know, ally themselves and grow the strongest. So I understood it, and I get that, and I do see that as a positive. But there is so many options and so many different paths to victory that it really strays quite a bit from the one specific road to victory. And I wish, kind of instead of giving so many options, that there was certain chapters where you were supposed to focus on certain resources, or supposed to focus on your role in certain conflicts. It's not hard to find some of the best history content out there supporting this kind of a game, which is kind of why we're here in the first place. We're here to analyze, we're here to critique, we're here to make sure that it is a step in the right direction. Which brings me to my final thing I have to say about this game, and I think it is absolutely a step in the right direction. While many of those features that I mentioned, the content, tended to stray from the historical accuracy for me, I think overall people are going to be left with the variety as being a net positive for historical accuracy. As I mentioned, things like trade being super important, your starting location being super important, these are all key features that I think lead to a historical experience while you're playing this game that is unlike many other kinds of games that are out there. I hope it's one that different games take a look at and really implore this idea of variety in terms of history. And of course, the probably biggest one here is the romance, the records. Those two modes are staples for this game, and I think you really wouldn't have the same kind of experience without that balancing act of the realism, the gritty, the settings that are jacked up to the strategy, versus the more character, more intimate moments, more fantasy elements that really do combine to tell the whole of the Three Kingdoms story. You know, just because it's based on a novel doesn't mean that it's not culturally important. And games work that way as well. They use history to tell their story, to ground their setting, and to create their experience. So, with that, after you do your homework, I definitely recommend that you give this one a try.